Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Molly Smith, Artistic Director of Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. And we're here to talk about some of my absolute favorite people: adolescents, young adults, tweens, and teens. And I'm here with three people who care very much about young people. So let me introduce them. Anne Friedman, who is the founder and chief executive of Planet Word, an interactive museum about language. Margot Shetterly is the author of Hidden Figures and the founder of the Human Computer Project. And David Bruce Smith is a children's book author and founder of the Grateful American Foundation. Welcome, everybody. So let's start with you, Margot. How has your book, Hidden Figures, sparked the curiosity of young readers?
Getting the chance to meet kids in classrooms or at events and sign their books and to hear their firsthand stories of how the stories of these women, of Dorothy Vaughan, Mary Jackson, Katherine Johnson, and Christine Darden, have either inspired them to take their math skills and science skills to the next level, or even, and I think maybe this is more important, inspired them to do their best even when it's hard and when they don't want to go to school and they feel like they can't do well in the math test. It's given them something. I think these women have given them something to hold on to push through when it's hard. So that's something that's been just extraordinarily gratifying to me during this entire process.
You know, I've seen the film and it's absolutely brilliant. So I love the idea that young people have been talking to you and talking to you, I would assume, as young women who are nervous about mathematics, and that this may have sparked something in them.
Overwhelmingly so, and I would say that most of them, some majority of them are young women. But what I think is also fantastic is that there's so many young men who have also found these women to be superheroes. I think that's one of the real joys, is to see the crossover appeal of these women, that people of all backgrounds and ages and students of all backgrounds and ages have been drawn to them. But yes, it does have a particular appeal for women and young women and girls who maybe have gotten the message that they're not good at math, that math isn't good for, math is not a subject for girls. And to see these women succeed at such an extraordinarily high level, I think has opened their minds to what might be possible for them as well.
I love their fortitude and their perseverance and their ability to just keep breaking through every obstacle that was put in front of them.
They did, and one of the things that was also true is they did it with the support of their families and their communities. One of the things that I love so much about this story, being somebody who was from that community and knew these women, and consider myself the legacy of those women, is that even though it's about them, those specific women, by extension, it's also about the larger group of women and also about the larger community that supported them and nurtured them and educated them and made it possible for them to do their best work.
Anne, I understand that you started Planet Word and you were a fifth grade teacher, and that you began a little later in life than many teachers. So why in the first place did you decide to become a teacher?
Starting in third grade, I wanted to be a teacher. I used to go home from school and go to the head of the class. But then as I got older, I sort of, found other things that interested me. But then for about a decade, my husband and I lived overseas, and we lived in two places, Jerusalem and Beirut, both cities that were torn by civil strife. And so I vowed to myself that when we eventually moved back to the United States, that I would do something to create community. And the first thing I did was to teach English as a second language, and to also teach illiterate adults, functionally illiterate adults. And then from there, I decided to become a real teacher with credentials. And because the public schools in America are one of our last institutions that brings people together from all walks of life. And so I became a public school teacher in my mid-40s, and it was the best decision I ever made.
And now you've created a whole museum that is about language and words, which is almost follows through on that passion, doesn't it?
It does. There's a sort of a wavy line, or not so straight, between being a teacher and then founding a museum. But it's because of my love of literacy, really. So when I retired as a teacher, I wanted to continue doing something to improve the state of literacy and encourage reading and love of words and language. And so I read about a museum in New York that was bringing math to life through technology. And I said, oh, maybe I could do that. Before then, I never, ever intended or imagined that I would found a museum. But I'm happy to meet Margot, because in our museum, we have a magic library where words and books come to life. And one of the books that we chose, and not because I'd ever met Margot, was the young adult version of Hidden Figures. It's a perfect book to have in our library, where we want to have books that speak to all kinds of people, all kinds of readers, ages, and interests of all kind.
Can't wait to come and see the exhibition.
I hope you will like what we've done with your
I cannot
book.
wait. I cannot wait.
And I'm curious, because literacy is something that is such a powerful part of your story. Do you have a story about a student who had a critical turning point in terms of language, in terms of words, that you can share with us?
Once, when I was teaching 5th grade, I had a student who refused to read the book that she would have normally been reading. And so I worked with her and her mother and found an alternative for her. And I think that that's something that I've learned also as a parent. Let your children or students' interests drive their choices, as long as they're not missing some core concept that all students need to experience or learn about eventually in their academic careers. But it was an easy thing to do, to let her choose something else to read that was of interest to her. And that's one of the key reasons why young people don't choose to read, and less so as time goes on, because the books don't speak to them, don't show their lives, what's relevant, the problems that they're confronting, the neighborhoods where they live. So in Planet Word, for sure, we tried to touch on all those possibilities. So someone walking through the door of the museum will find a relevant book, poem, song, speech, something that touches them.
It reminds me of what we try to do here at Arena Stage. I always call it follow the artist. Because sometimes you can have a commission with an artist and they make a change and decide to write about something else. And I'll have some of my staff that will say, oh my God, how can they do that? They were commissioned for this. And I said, no, follow the artist, because they always know where to go. It's from inside of them. So I think it's really great that that's what you're talking about in terms of working with young people. Follow what their own interests are. That's a great story. Great story. David, I want to turn to you and find out from you first, because David, I know you are an incredible reader. And I'm curious about what role did reading play in your life when you were growing up as a little boy?
Well, I would say that my grandfather is completely responsible for my reading career, because when I was 6 years old, he told me it was very important to read biographies about important people like FDR, Lincoln, Golda Meir, Twain. And the reason for that was if I continued on it, then by the time I grew up, I would have a reservoir of wisdom. Now, for him, wisdom was the highest form of knowledge.
Can we draw a direct line from your early life of reading through to what you've chosen to make your life work?
Yes, because I think reading others helps you with your own reading and writing. Now, if, for example, you want to find a voice of or understand the voice of a young person, then you can read Hidden Figures. Or if you want to learn about it in a three-dimensional way, you can go to Anne's Museum, Planet Word. Or you can see a power play at Arena Stage. Now, when my mother and I were writing children's books together, the first one was on John Marshall, who was the fourth Chief Justice. And I had never written for children. This was a commission, but my children were then relatively young. So I took the manuscript to them and I asked them if I was close. And they said I was.
That just reminded me, Margot, what do you tap into?
You know, I think that remembering what it was like to be 9 or 10 years old and the kinds of books that I loved and the kind of imagination that the great, you know, the books that I loved, the ones that sparked something, just really trying to conjure that feeling again and that sense of understanding that truly between the pages of the book was this entire world and a life that you could live even as you lived your own life, another life that came to you while you were reading the book.
How about for you, Anne?
I just read voraciously as a child. What David and Margot have both said about influences on them as a child, it makes me think of my own daughter. We took a trip to Japan and she needed something to read. And she went in a little hotel bookstore that happened to have some books in English. And she found a book called Toto-chan. And it's about a little girl, a little Japanese girl who does not like her school, but she loves education and reading. And that book made such a difference on my daughter, who eventually became a teacher and has now started her own school where children have agency. They can choose to follow their own interests. And I think it's all stems back, trace it back to her finding this book on her own that spoke to her.
When I was a little girl, I was a great reader too. And I would just have stacks of books in my bedroom next to my little twin bed. And in the first grade, you would get a reading crown if you were the best reader of the week, which you got to wear home. And when you wore it home, your family would give you a present, some kind of a present, ice cream or something, right? And I would often win the writing crown, but I didn't win it often enough. So I made my own winning crown and wore it home every week. And my mother at some point realized that maybe this was a problem, that I had not been getting this on my own. So that stopped that. But I will say that my love of reading has just continued throughout my entire life. I think if you're able to read, you're never lonely, ever.
Right.
You know, we always have friends. We always have somebody else to be able to talk to. And David, I'm so curious about which particular moments in history that maybe you didn't learn about in school are ones that are important to you now and that you're interested in doing books about now?
Well, I look at history now through the lens of historic / presidential couples that had equal partnerships. So my mother and I did a book on Abigail and John Adams. And the next one would have been the Carters. But I'm very interested in what goes on inside of a marriage. And I think that can be presented in appropriate ways to kids, because very often when we were doing the book on John Marshall, the average biography was very flat. It didn't tell you things like she was depressed for most of the marriage because they lost 4 children, or that she had tinnitus, or any of that stuff. So I think children's books need to be more realistic.
So, Anne, I'm curious because I love the core values that you have at Planet Word: fun, playful, unexpected, motivational, meaningful, and inclusive. Can you talk a little bit about why you and your team chose some of those words to pull people in?
If you're hoping that anyone who walks through the doors of your museum will leave with a renewed or new love of words and language and reading, you've got to do something special. One of the things you can do with a museum is make learning fun. Museums are places for informal education. So fun and playful had to be in that list of core values that would inform all of our choices about what exhibits or gallery experiences we would include in the museum, because we're not very big. We're a kind of small space. So we can't have experiences and exhibits on every topic touching on words and language. We had to limit it, but we wanted to find a fun and playful and unexpected way to present those ideas, and motivational. They should touch something in you and move you and inspire some emotional reaction. Meaningful. Well, if it was just silly, we didn't have room to have that idea in the museum. It had to be meaningful on some level. And inclusive is maybe the most important of those 6 core values. We built inclusivity into the very core, the infrastructure of the museum. It's a free museum, so everyone can come in. We've got scripts from all over the world embedded in our terrazzo floors. We have different languages for where's the bathroom, or words for toilet embedded in our tile walls in the restrooms. So we built this fun, playful, meaningful, inclusive experience into the building.
Margot, I just wanted to go back to Hidden Figures for a moment. What do you think the impacts are to a research field when you have the great success of a major book and film like Hidden Figures?
What I hope happens is hopefully 2 things. One, that it's demystified and it makes it a little more accessible, so that if there is a little 5-year-old girl who happens to like math or is interested in airplanes, or then it's demystified enough that she could see some kind of trajectory between herself and those women. So I think that's one thing. And then I think to hopefully, I don't know if thank is the right word, but to really say to those people who did that hard work of sending people into space, and more importantly, really like making airplanes safe. I mean, that was the fundamental work that these women did before space was on the table. We get in an airplane, it takes off, it flies, it lands, it's safe. That's the work that they did. And that for me has also been an exciting part of this work, and to think about the people whose technical skills have actually made a difference in our daily lives.
What was the moment that told you as a writer, ooh, I want to write about this subject?
Well, it's interesting. I was visiting my parents back in 2010. And such a long time ago now, it's unbelievable. Anyway, and my husband and I ran into one of the former NASA human computers, and my dad, who's a retired NASA research scientist, happened to be talking about this particular woman and her work, and turned into a broader discussion of all of the women, this larger group of women, and their role in the space program and aeronautics. And so my husband's like, wow, I never heard that story before. And for me, having grown up there with this as background, it was sort of a question that pushed it to the foreground and made me curious about how they'd gotten there, why there were so many women at NASA when I went to go visit my dad at work, why there were so many Black women who were also older. So you start doing the math, you're like, okay, they were working there during a time of segregation. Like, what is this story? This is, this is something that I know from experience, but I don't know the details. And writing the book was a way for me to uncover the beginning of the story.
Do you think that the life of science that must have been very much within your household was something that allowed you to tackle a subject like this?
Absolutely. Yeah. My dad, my mom's an English professor, also retired. So she's the one who, drilled me on the spelling bee words, and it sparked that love of language. But, my dad with me and, my three siblings, all the math classes, the science fairs, the calculus, the algebra, whatever the most rigorous course was available to us, we took it and then some. I think that familiarity with science meant that it wasn't a mystery, and that I had enough technical skills, math skills, to do the research, which involved reading a lot of the reports, the original work that these women did back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 30s, 40s, and not shying away from understanding it enough. I mean, I'm not an engineer, but understanding it enough to translate it for the purposes of the narrative.
I had a business I was a liberal arts person, but I had a business background for 20 years. And then I switched to being a full-time writer. And it happened purely by accident. I was in the car one day and I was listening to NPR, and I heard that the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia had sponsored a historical literacy test. And the results were that 80% of the people who were polled believed that the Revolutionary War took place after the Civil War.
Wow.
So I thought, oh God,
Well, that's scary.
This is really bad. Maybe there's something, I could contribute to help ameliorate the problem. And so I started the Grateful American Foundation and the Grateful American Book Prize for seventh and ninth graders. It encourages reading nonfiction, historical fiction, and biography. And I picked that age group because 7th, 8th, and 9th grades are very difficult times for most people, socially, hormonally, academically. And I think that if a kid is not willing to get professional help, well, then maybe a book can become akin to a paper psychiatrist.
Margot, what do you think is something that parents and teachers can help do to spark young people's creativity?
Well, I really do concur with a lot of what David and Anne have said of listening to what they're interested in and giving them the books that sort of resonate with them, and that that they recognize themselves and their circumstances and their interest to see that reflected. So I certainly think that's one thing. And then, I think also that parents and teachers telling kids that that something can be difficult and you can also be good at it at the same time, that those two things go together, and that pursuing your passion and being good at your passion doesn't mean that there won't be bumps along the way or challenges along the way. And that taking the easy road might not be the road that you're supposed to take, that you may be missing out on your life's work, to the extent that you think about that when you're that young. But you may be missing out on the thing that's the most fulfilling if you avoid something simply because it's difficult.
I wonder if anyone else read a story in the newspaper yesterday about a little girl, she's now not a little girl, who loved insects and bugs. But when she was young, she had so many questions, and she wrote to a professor and asked whether walking sticks have knees. And this professor took the time to write back to this little girl about her interest in bugs. And then lo and behold, many years later, she is getting a PhD in entomology. I just think it's so important. Parents, teachers, whoever you are out there, let a child's passion flower, find the books, the experiences that they need to pursue their love of any subject. If they want to bring scorpions home, find out how to do that safely.
I'm curious to hear from each one of you. In your profession, have you had wrong turns along the way? A project maybe that didn't work out well? And what did you do about it? How did you change course?
After I started the Grateful American Foundation, I thought, all right, so now I'm going to make videos at the founding father and mother homes, but I'm going to position it so that Mount Vernon is called George and Martha's Mount Vernon instead of just George, because that leaves out little girls. Same thing at Montpelier would be James and Dolly's Montpelier, because otherwise little girls come to these homes and they're just places where old men died a long time ago and it doesn't mean anything. So I thought this was going to be a real big bang. Well, we made about 50 videos and it was a big bust. So I switched gears and I did the start of the Grateful American Book Prize, which is just as fun, just as good.
Anne or Margot, anything?
Well, like David, actually, my first career before being a writer was as a business person. And I worked on Wall Street and then worked in internet media. And then my husband and I became entrepreneurs, and we started two businesses, a magazine and actually a small internet company, and ran them and then closed them, each first one, then the other. And it was after the second business that we closed that I started working on Hidden Figures. And but I will say that absolutely everything that I learned along the way in my previous lives to becoming a writer, including those hard times of starting a business, running a business, and closing a business, has helped and prepared me for what is I absolutely consider the best job I've ever had and could ever have.
So I'm really interested from each of you if there was a particular teacher that just spun you into a whole other way of thinking, that changed your life somehow. I actually had a teacher in economics when I was probably in my freshman year of college. And I didn't think that would be a subject I would be interested in at all as an artist. And he took me, and through telling stories about economics, it completely turned my mind around. And it helps me be able to read a spreadsheet now too.
That's so interesting, Molly, because I had a high school economics teacher who had a similar effect on me. I had never heard of the science of economics
Yep.
before, and it was such a new way of looking at the world and thinking about, the news and what was happening. And so he definitely made a big impact on my life because, like Margot, my first job was in finance. I worked on Wall Street.
Wow.
So not where I should have been at all. And I'm glad I found my way back to teaching. But the economics teacher really made a difference. And can I also just talk about a teacher that my daughter had in second grade? She was a national presidential award-winning second grade teacher. She did things like take her second grade class to the moon, and they all thought that they really were going to the moon, and they had freeze-dried food, and they made vests to be like astronauts, and learned all about the moon and outer space. And she was just a fantastic teacher. And she also had become a teacher later in life after a career in science. And actually, she was a role model for me and convinced me to become a teacher. I said, I want to be like her.
We know that there are a lot of young people who don't want to read a book, who are not interested in reading. How would you encourage them to pick up a book?
Those teachers who come into contact with kids, particularly when they're really young, have to take them seriously as individuals, and not talk down to them as little kids, but talk to them as young individuals with interests that are legitimate, whether it is bugs or literature or whatever it is. My first grade teacher, Mrs. Gwendolyn Chisman at Captain John Smith Elementary School in Hampton, Virginia, was amazing because she took us seriously, little 6-year-old kids. On the first day of school, we walked in and she was like, this is it. This is when your educational career begins, and she was the kind of teacher that, that when you're a little kid, you call the mean teacher because she was very strict, but her standards were high. And everybody who went through Mrs. Chisman's first grade class was prepared, not just in the substance of whatever it was that we learned in first grade, but in this communicating to us that school and ourselves, our educations, were something to be taken seriously. And I am eternally grateful for having had her as a teacher when I was 6 years old.
And how about you? How do you work with children who just don't want to read?
So I don't worry about it as founder of Planet Word. We're made for those kids. That's why we exist, because we're trying to find some hook, a way into the world of words and language. And it doesn't have to be because you read something, first of all, but maybe it's because you love rap music and you want to sing and you want to write lyrics and you're interested in rhyming. And so that's your key. We are just interested in finding some way that we can show sort of the glories and the pleasures of using words and language. Maybe it's in our humor writing gallery where you learn what makes something funny. You learn about idioms. Maybe it's in our oratory gallery where you give a speech from a teleprompter and then you decide, oh, I'll run for student government. I'm really good at giving a speech.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not so worried at Planet Word about reading books specifically. we're just trying to find a way to interest people and in words. And then if that leads to reading, that would be fantastic.
We do something at Arena Stage in our camp, Arena Stage. It's a multidisciplinary camp for young people. And there are about 30 classes that they can choose from in a single day. Anything from claymation to African dance to life drawing to costume design to choral music to being in a rock band. And what I find is even young people that people would say, oh, they're a little bit troubled or they're a little bit troubled at home, they're joyful because they're being treated as young artists. And that's what we call them. We call them young artists. And we bring them in and they are busy creating from morning to night. And by the end of it, there is a real sense of their own self-expression and their ability to be able to talk and communicate in a way that they hadn't been before. So I think there is something about giving young people a lot and a lot of positive reinforcement as they go through it that changes young people. Do you all think that we have now moved into a period of time where there are more and more diverse books that are being written about different kinds of kids, different ableism with kids, different color within kids? Are we seeing a real explosion of that? Margot, you're nodding your head. Talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's incredible, the different backgrounds and historical perspectives, along every possible category that you can imagine for kids is dramatically different. I think it's really exciting to read those books and to still have, the ones like, Lyle the Crocodile or whatever that those old favorites. And I think in addition to, the sort of background of the writers and the subjects of the book, I think also, I am really interested, David, in the idea that you have of talking about these presidential marriages and sort of taking these figures off the pedestal and showing them as humans in all of their flaws and their complications and the relationships. And, I think even the perspective that it's not just the sort of, great man biography, but like stepping back and saying, okay, who is this person and what were their relationships with other people? That the perspective has changed and people want that and they expect that now.
One last question, which is, what was your absolute favorite book growing up?
If anybody is looking at the background behind me, that wallpaper is made out of pages from The Secret Garden, which was my favorite book as a child. And the ironic thing is that the author, Frances Hodgson Burnett, lived a block away from the Franklin School where Planet Word is located. So it sort of has, it had to be that book would be my favorite, and it needs to be on the walls of my office at Planet Word.
Okay, so mine was Gone with the Wind. And when I was 8 years old, I asked my mother, I said, who are these Yankees? And she said, you.
I love it, Margot.
Yeah, so I'd have to say A Wrinkle in Time by Madeline L'Engle. I read that book so many times as a kid, and I reread it a couple of years ago, and it still stands up.
Wonderful. And for me, it was Little House on the Prairie by Laura Ingalls. I'm from a very Western family, so it kind of made sense that's what I tied into. Well, this has just been a great conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you for opening doors for young people as far as their ability to be able to see a wider world, a different world.
This video was produced through a partnership of the Grateful American Foundation and WETA. For more information about adolescent literacy, please visit adlit.org.